Tonight, we follow you up a narrow servants' staircase in a sprawling London townhouse. The hem of your dark wool dress brushing against worn stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet much like yours. It is just past 5 in the morning, and the city outside remains a muffled mystery of fog and distant horse hooves. But here, in the chill of this unfamiliar home, your day has already begun. You clutch a candle that casts more shadows than light, its flame dancing nervously as you navigate toward the nursery, that peculiar no-man's land where you will spend your waking hours caught between the family above stairs and the servants below. The house breathes around you, creaking floorboards, the distant clatter of a maid already stoking the kitchen fire, and you feel, as you always feel, like a ghost in someone else's story, permitted to exist here only as long as you remain useful, quiet, and invisible. Your hand, you notice, already aches in anticipation, because before breakfast, before you've even warmed yourself by the nursery fire, you will sit down with ink and paper and begin the ritual that defines your existence. The endless, exacting practice of perfect penmanship. And here's the thing about being a Victorian governess that nobody mentions in the novels. The part where your entire precarious future rests on the curve of a single capital letter, where one wobbly descender can mean the difference between a respectable position and the workhouse, where you will spend hours of your already exhausted life practicing loops and flourishes until your fingers cramp and your eyes blur, all because somewhere out there, a potential employer is going to hold a letter. You wrote and decide, based entirely on the shape of your handwriting, whether you are morally fit to educate her children. You probably won't survive this career with your nerves intact, let alone your eyesight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle onto a hard wooden chair in the nursery, the only piece of furniture in this cold room that feels even remotely yours, though of course nothing here truly belongs to you. The nursery itself is a peculiar space, neither fully part of the family's elegant quarters nor quite relegated to the servants' realm. It is your kingdom, such as it is, a high-ceilinged room where the wallpaper flowers have faded to ghosts of themselves and the windows rattle slightly in their frames when the wind picks up. Your pupils, 3 children aged 6 to 11, remain blissfully asleep in the adjoining bedroom, their breathing soft and undisturbed, unaware that their governess is already at work before dawn, not preparing lessons or mending their stockings, but practicing something far more fundamental, the shape of her own letters. You dip your pen into the inkwell, that familiar scraping sound of metal against ceramic, and you pause for just a moment before the nib touches paper. This moment, this breath before the first mark, carries the weight of everything. The paper before you is not cheap. Good paper costs more than you can comfortably afford, which means this sheet will be used and reused, written upon, then perhaps gently erased with breadcrumbs, then written upon again until it frays at the edges and can take no more. You cannot waste it. You cannot make mistakes. And yet your hand trembles slightly from the cold, from the early hour, from the constant low-grade anxiety that hums beneath every moment of your existence. The script you practice is copperplate, that elegant, flowing hand that defines Victorian penmanship, with its rhythmic thick and thin strokes, its perfectly proportioned loops, its disciplined slant that must lean consistently to the right at exactly 52 degrees. You have been practicing this script since you were a child yourself, back when you still had hopes of marriage or a comfortable life, back before your father died and your circumstances shifted and you found yourself here, alone, dependent on the kindness of strangers who would never quite see you as their equal. Your fingers remember the motions even when your mind wanders, the pressure on the downstrokes, the light touch on the upstrokes, the way the nib must be held at precisely the right angle to avoid scratching the paper or leaving blots. You begin with basic drills, the foundation of everything, rows and rows of connected ovals, because the oval is the building block of copperplate, the shape from which all letters emerge. O after O after O, each one identical to the last, your wrist moving in a controlled arc, your breathing steady, your concentration absolute. Then ascending loops, the letters L and H and K, practicing the way the stroke rises gracefully before curling back upon itself. Then descending loops, G and J and Y, watching the ink flow downward in a perfect curve. Over and over, until your hand knows the movements without your mind directing them, until the shapes become as natural as breathing. This is not merely practice. This is survival. The hours pass in this rhythm, stroke, dip, as the darkness outside the window slowly softens into gray, then pale morning light. Your candle gutters and dies, but you barely notice, because by now the room has brightened enough to continue. Your hand moves automatically, producing line after line of perfect script, and your mind drifts to the children who will soon wake, to the lessons you must conduct, to the meals you will take alone in your room because you are too refined to eat with servants but not refined enough to eat with the family. But beneath all of that, beneath the daily anxieties and small humiliations, there remains this: the pen moving across paper, the ink flowing, the letters forming exactly as they should. And when you finally stop, when your hand cramps and you set down the pen to flex your fingers, you look at what you've produced, page after page of perfect copperplate, drills and phrases, and maybe, tucked in the corner, your own name written in your finest hand, just to remind yourself that you exist, that you are someone, that these letters flowing from your pen are, in some small way, you. Then you tear the pages carefully, fold them small, tuck them into your pocket to dispose of later, because nobody must know how much you practice, how desperately you work to maintain this skill that keeps you employed, how fragile your position truly is. The children are stirring now. You hear small footsteps, sleepy voices calling for nurse, and you smooth your dress, touch your hair, compose your face into the calm, pleasant expression expected of you. By the time the nursery door opens and a small, rumpled face appears, you are seated at the table with a book open before you, a governess ready for her day, and nobody would ever guess that you've already been working for hours, that your hand aches from writing, that everything you are and everything you hope to be rests on the curve of a single perfect letter. You smooth the page you've just written, your fingers tracing the elegant curves of copperplate script that flow across the paper like a frozen river, and you allow yourself a small moment of satisfaction before reality crashes back in. This sheet, covered in your finest handwriting, is not merely practice. It is your most valuable professional asset, the single piece of evidence that might convince a stranger to trust you with her children, her household, her entire domestic peace. In the world you inhabit, where a woman alone has few options and fewer protections, your handwriting functions as both resume and character reference, a silent ambassador that precedes you into every drawing room where your fate might be decided. The morning light has strengthened now, creeping across the nursery floor in pale yellow rectangles, and you can hear the children arguing softly in the next room about who gets to dress first. Their voices are small, unimportant against the weight of what you're considering, that the letter you wrote last week, the one applying for a position in a different household, is currently being examined by a lady you've never met, who holds your future in her hands and knows nothing about you except what your handwriting reveals. She will study the slant of your letters. Too far right suggests emotional excess, too vertical hints at coldness, and she will judge the pressure of your pen, the consistency of your spacing, the way you form your capital letters. And based on these judgments, she will decide whether to invite you for an interview or toss your application onto the fire. This is not exaggeration. This is the mechanical reality of your existence. You remember your first position, secured entirely because the lady of the house admired the way you wrote a thank you note to her cousin. You remember the governess you met once, briefly, at a park where she walked her charges and you walked yours. She told you, in hushed, desperate tones, that she had been dismissed from her last position because her handwriting deteriorated during an illness. and the mistress decided this proved she was letting herself go. That moral decay surely followed physical carelessness. The woman had found another position eventually, she said, but only after months of practicing 8 hours a day, rebuilding her script from scratch, teaching her hand to forget its weakness and perform strength it did not feel. You glance toward the door, ensuring the children aren't yet ready to burst through, and you pull from your pocket a small folded paper you've carried for weeks. It is a letter of reference from your last position, written by the lady herself, and you've memoized every word though you've read it hundreds of times. The handwriting is elegant, as befits a lady of her station, but you're not studying the content now. You're studying the signature at the bottom, the way she formed her name, the particular flourish she added beneath it. Because somewhere in this house, tucked into a desk drawer or perhaps already mailed, is a letter you wrote to a potential employer, and on that letter you signed your own name, and somewhere a stranger is comparing your signature to this reference, looking for consistency, for evidence that you are who you claim to be. The thought makes your stomach clench. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that hovers at the edges of every governess's consciousness. Your handwriting is not just a skill but a performance, a daily act of self-presentation that must be flawless because you are never off stage. When you write a letter to your mother, you must write beautifully, because the household might steam open the envelope and read it. When you jot a note to the housekeeper about supplies, you must write beautifully, because she might show it to the mistress as evidence of your education. When you practice in the early morning, you must practice beautifully, because someone might walk in and see your work and judge you accordingly. There is no private script, no casual scrawl, no moment when you can let your hand relax into its natural, unguarded shape. Your handwriting is always on display, always being evaluated, always carrying the weight of your entire precarious existence. The children burst through the door then, a tumble of energy and noise that shatters your reverie, and you quickly fold the reference letter and tuck it away before they can see. The eldest, a girl of 11 named Eleanor who already understands too much about the world, notices the movement and gives you a look that suggests she knows you're hiding something, though she's polite enough not to ask. The younger two, Charles, 8, and little Amelia, 6, clamber onto their chairs and immediately begin arguing about who gets to sit closest to the fire. You calm them with practiced ease, distributing slates and chalk, setting them to copying letters while you prepare the morning's proper lesson. Charles complains immediately, as he always does, that his letters look nothing like the examples you've written, that his chalk keeps breaking, that Amelia is copying his work. You correct him gently, adjust his grip on the chalk, show him again how to form the letter A with its pointed top and rounded belly. But even as you do this, even as your attention focuses on these small, squirming children who have no idea how fortunate they are to learn their letters in a warm nursery with plenty of chalk, part of your mind remains fixed on that letter, traveling through London toward some unknown drawing room, carrying your fate in its careful loops and precise slant. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with handwriting reflected genuine belief in its moral significance or served primarily as a mechanism of class control, a way for the upper classes to identify outsiders, to maintain boundaries, to ensure that anyone who wished to serve them could be instantly evaluated and categorized. You don't have the luxury of scholarly detachment. For you, this debate is lived reality. Your handwriting marks you as educated but not aristocratic, skilled but not creative, disciplined but not passionate. It places you precisely in the social hierarchy, above servants who cannot write at all, below ladies who never need to write for pay. It announces, in every carefully formed letter, that you are qualified to teach but not to belong. The morning lessons continue, reading, arithmetic, a bit of geography with a worn map that shows colonies in pink and empire in red. The children squirm and daydream and occasionally produce work that surprises you with its insight. And through it all, you watch their handwriting develop, noting the way Charles presses too hard and breaks his nibs, the way Eleanor's letters slant slightly differently on each line, the way little Amelia forms her letters with painstaking care as if she understands already that these shapes matter, that they will be judged, that handwriting is never just handwriting. At midday, when the children are handed over to nurse for their walk in the park, you retreat to your room with a cup of tea that has gone cold and a fresh sheet of paper. The letter you wrote last week, the one currently being examined by a stranger, was good, you think. Your best work, certainly. But good enough? You'll never know until you receive a reply, and even then, if the reply never comes, you'll never know whether it was your handwriting that failed you or simply the overcrowded market for governesses or the lady's preference for someone taller or younger or from a different county. You dip your pen and begin again, practicing your signature this time, writing your name over and over in your finest hand. Because if that letter fails, there will be another letter, and each one must be perfect, must be slightly better than the last, must convince someone somewhere that you are worth hiring, worth trusting, worth that precarious place at the edge of their firelight. Your hand moves steadily, your name flowing from the pen in an endless stream, each repetition a small prayer aimed at a future you cannot see but must continue to pursue. You sit at the small writing desk in your room, the one piece of furniture that truly belongs to you in this house, and you study the copperplate guidebook that has become your Bible, your tormentor, your most intimate companion. The pages are soft with use, the margins filled with your own practice strokes and notes to yourself about techniques that work or fail. This book, purchased years ago with money you could ill afford, contains the entire architecture of your professional identity, every rule about letter formation, every instruction about pen hold and wrist position, every diagram showing the exact proportions of ascenders and descenders, the precise angle of slant, the proper relationship between thick downstrokes and hairline upstrokes. And what you're studying tonight, by the thin light of a single candle because you cannot afford more and the household would frown on waste, is the section on shades, those deliberate thickenings of certain strokes that give copperplate its characteristic rhythm and elegance. The downstroke of the letter D must swell slightly at the curve. The final stroke of an M must carry a delicate shade that tapers to nothing. The capital letters, those glorious flourishes that announce the beginning of a sentence, must be constructed from a series of precisely weighted strokes that together create something almost architectural in its balanced beauty. Your hand remembers these movements, of course. After years of practice, the shapes flow naturally enough. But tonight you're not practicing for fluency, you're practicing for perfection, because you've heard through the gossiping servants that the lady of the house has invited a guest who might be interested in engaging a governess for her own children, and you intend to position yourself where she cannot help but notice your handwriting. It will be subtle, of course. You'll leave a letter half written on the nursery table when you're called to present the children. You'll offer to write down a recipe the cook needs, performing the task with such unconscious grace that the guest will ask about your education. You'll manufacture opportunities for your hand to be seen, for your script to speak on your behalf. This is the dance you've learned. Never appear to seek attention, never seem desperate, never let anyone suspect how carefully you orchestrate these moments. A governess who tries too hard is immediately suspect. A governess who appears effortless, whose accomplishments seem natural and unstudied, whose handwriting flows from her pen as easily as breath, that governess might be considered. That governess might be offered a position. The copperplate obsession that grips Victorian England, you've come to understand, is about far more than beautiful letters. It's about control. Control of the hand, control of the mind, control of the moral impulses that might otherwise express themselves in uncontrolled ways. The theory, widely taught and fervently believed, holds that disciplined handwriting produces disciplined character, that the hours spent forming perfect ovals and consistent slants actually reshape the soul, that a person who writes beautifully cannot think ugly thoughts. You're not entirely certain you believe this, but you've learned to perform as if you do. because believing it, or appearing to believe it, is part of what keeps you employed. The surprising detail that few outside your profession appreciate is that copperplate script requires not just practice but physical conditioning, a specific muscular development that must be maintained through daily exercise. Your forearm muscles have strengthened over the years into something almost like an athlete's, though nobody would ever call a governess athletic. The small muscles of your hand and fingers have been trained to hold the pen with precisely the right pressure, to execute thousands of microscopic adjustments with each stroke, to maintain perfect control even when you're exhausted or ill or shaking with cold. When you write, your whole arm moves in a controlled arc, the motion originating from the shoulder rather than the wrist, a technique that allows for greater fluidity and consistency but requires constant practice to maintain. This physical dimension of handwriting explains why your hand aches most mornings, why you sometimes wake with cramps that take hours to loosen, why you've developed calluses in places that would surprise anyone who imagined writing as gentle labor. You are, in a very real sense, an athlete of the pen, training daily to perform feats of precise muscular control that most people never attempt and cannot appreciate. The children, when you teach them, have no idea that they are being initiated into this physical discipline. For them, handwriting lessons are tedious exercises, hours of copying meaningless phrases while their friends play outside and their muscles protest the unnatural stillness. Charles, especially, fights you on this. He wants to run, to climb, to use his body in ways that feel natural and satisfying, and instead you make him sit at a desk and move his hand in tiny controlled circles while his legs twitch with unspent energy. He doesn't understand that you're training his muscles as surely as any drill sergeant, that the neural pathways you're building will serve him his whole life, that the discipline of handwriting connects to every other discipline he'll ever need. You don't explain this to him because he's 8 and wouldn't care, and also because you're not entirely sure you believe it yourself. Sometimes, in your darker moments, you suspect that all this handwriting practice is merely busy work, a way to keep children occupied and governesses employed, an elaborate ritual that masks the essential emptiness of your position. But then you receive a letter from a former pupil, now grown, whose handwriting has developed into something beautiful and distinctive, and you feel a surge of pride that suggests maybe, this work matters beyond the immediate moment. Historians still argue whether the Victorian emphasis on penmanship represented genuine educational philosophy or merely a convenient method of social sorting. The debate interests you academically, but practically, you know the answer: it was both. Yes, beautiful handwriting indicated education and refinement. Yes, it provided a visible marker of class status. Yes, it served as a convenient filter for employers seeking to distinguish between candidates. But it also, undeniably, produced beautiful results. The letters you write, the documents you create, the records you keep, these things will outlast you, will survive in attics and archives long after you're forgotten, will testify to the care and discipline you brought to your work. The guest arrives the next afternoon, a Mrs. Whitmore from Derbyshire, and you execute your plan with the precision of long practice. You've left a half-finished letter on the nursery table, a note to your fictional cousin about household matters, written in your very finest hand but deliberately abandoned mid-sentence as if you were called away unexpectedly. When Mrs. Whitmore is brought to the nursery to meet the children, you apologize for the mess, begin to gather your papers, and pause just long enough for her to see the writing. She notices. Of course she notices. Every lady of her class has been trained to notice handwriting, to evaluate it unconsciously, to draw conclusions from its quality. She glances at the page, then looks at you with new interest, and asks, quite casually, whether you studied penmanship with a master or developed your hand independently. You answer modestly, describing the hours of practice, the guidebooks, the constant effort to improve. You mention, as if incidentally, that you believe handwriting reveals character, that you've always strived to make your letters reflect the qualities you wish to cultivate. She nods approvingly, and you know, that you've passed some invisible test, that your handwriting has spoken for you in ways your spoken words could not. Later that evening, a note arrives from Mrs. Whitmore, delivered by a maid who seems impressed by the honor. The note invites you to tea tomorrow, to discuss a possible position in Derbyshire. You read it 3 times, studying not just the content but the handwriting itself, elegant but slightly rushed, with interesting variations in slant that suggest a woman who writes often and values efficiency over perfect form. You'll need to match this handwriting, you realize, if you take the position. You'll need to study it, adapt to it, make your own letters harmonize with hers so that any documents you produce together will appear consistent. This is the depth of your profession, not just writing beautifully, but writing beautifully in the style that pleases your employer, adjusting your hand to match another's expectations, performing not just skill but perfect alignment with the household's aesthetic. You begin practicing immediately, adapting your copperplate to approximate Mrs. Whitmore's slightly looser style, preparing yourself for a future that may or may not arrive. You dip your pen into the inkwell and immediately know something is wrong. The ink is too thin, watery in a way that suggests someone has added something to it. Water, most likely, though you wouldn't put it past the children to have experimented with their paintbrushes when you weren't looking. You write a test stroke and watch in horror as the ink bleeds across the paper, spreading into feathery edges that ruin the clean lines of your copperplate, turning what should be a precise thick stroke into a fuzzy, undefined mess. This paper, expensive paper that you ration carefully, is now ruined, and worse, the letter you were about to write, an important letter, a reply to Mrs. Whitmore about that possible position in Derbyshire, will have to wait until you can obtain better ink or somehow fix this batch. You sit back in your chair, pen still dripping, and feel the familiar crush of frustration that comes with being dependent on others for the basic materials of your profession. In a proper household, ink would be the housekeeper's responsibility, purchased in quantity and maintained at the proper consistency. But you're not quite of the household, are you? You're somewhere in between, expected to provide your own supplies for some things, permitted to use household supplies for others, never quite certain what you're entitled to and what you must purchase from your meager wages. The ink in this well came from the schoolroom supply, theoretically available for lessons, but you've learned that using it for your personal correspondence is technically allowed but socially questionable, the sort of thing that might be mentioned casually to the mistress if you fall out of favor. You should have checked the ink before dipping your pen. You should have tested it on a scrap, preserved your good paper, anticipated this exact problem. But you were distracted, thinking about Derbyshire, thinking about what it would mean to leave this household and start fresh somewhere new. And now you've wasted paper you cannot easily replace and you're no closer to sending that reply. The children will be back from their walk soon, and you need to compose yourself before they arrive. You clean your pen carefully, set aside the ruined paper, and try to calculate how much of your wages you can spare for new supplies. There's a stationer's shop not far from here, on a street you pass when you take the children to the park, but you rarely have time to stop and even more rarely have money to spend. The few coins you manage to save each month go toward necessities. New nibs when the old ones wear down, paper when you absolutely cannot reuse another sheet, the occasional treat for the children because they respond better to kindness than to discipline, and kindness costs money you don't have. This constant calculation, this endless arithmetic of survival, shapes every decision you make about your handwriting practice. You write small to save paper, fitting more words onto each sheet. You use both sides, though this makes the writing slightly harder to read and definitely less elegant. You save every scrap of paper that comes into the nursery, wrapping paper smoothed flat, the blank sides of letters your mother sends, even the margins of newspapers, because any blank space is an opportunity to practice, to improve, to maintain the skill that keeps you employed. The surprising historical detail that haunts you is that paper itself was once so expensive that it fundamentally shaped how people wrote. Before the 19th century, when papermaking became industrialized and prices dropped significantly, ordinary people rarely wrote at all because they couldn't afford the materials. Even now, in your own time, paper costs represent a significant expense for someone in your position. Perhaps a day's wages for a ream of decent quality, more than that for the smooth, cream-colored paper that makes copperplate look its best. You dream sometimes of having unlimited paper, of being able to practice for hours without counting every sheet, of writing long letters to everyone you've ever known just because you can. But dreams don't fill inkwells, and wishes don't make paper cheaper. You think about the children you teach, who have never known this scarcity. When Charles ruins a sheet of paper with a careless blot, he doesn't think twice, he simply reaches for another, because the nursery is stocked with supplies provided by his father, and the cost means nothing to him. When Eleanor practices her letters, she fills page after page without ever considering that each sheet represents something valuable, something someone else might have saved for weeks to afford. They are not cruel children, not deliberately wasteful, but they have been raised in a world of abundance where paper flows like water and ink is simply there, always available, never rationed. You try to teach them thrift along with penmanship, explaining that they should use both sides of the paper, that they should plan their letters before committing ink to page, that every wasted sheet represents work by someone, the papermaker, the stationer, the household staff who maintain the supplies. They listen politely, mostly, and then forget immediately, because scarcity is not their reality and cannot be made real through explanation. Only experience teaches thrift, and you hope fervently that they never gain that experience, that they remain always in worlds where paper is abundant and ink flows freely. The ink in your well has not improved with sitting. If anything, it seems thinner now, more watery, as if someone deliberately sabotaged it. But no, that's paranoia talking, the edge of desperation that comes from living too long in a household where you don't quite belong. More likely, a maid added water to stretch the supply, not understanding that ink requires a specific consistency, that adding water ruins it for fine writing. Or perhaps the children did experiment, as children will, and then tried to hide the evidence by topping up the well with water. Either way, the ink is unusable, and you have no choice but to set aside your writing until you can obtain more. You spend the afternoon lesson teaching the children to make their own ink from a recipe you learned from an older governess, partly because it's a useful skill and partly because you're curious whether you can produce something usable yourself. The recipe is simple enough. Gum arabic, iron sulfate, and oak galls, all available from the chemist if you have money to spend, which you don't. But the children are delighted by the alchemy of it, watching the clear liquid darken as the ingredients combine, and for a little while you forget your frustration and simply enjoy their wonder. The ink they produce is not as good as what you're used to. It's slightly brown rather than deep black, and it flows unevenly from the pen, but it writes, and for now, that's enough. You write your reply to Mrs. Whitmore in this homemade ink, on paper you've used before on the other side, and you hope she understands, hope she reads between the lines of this slightly imperfect script and sees not carelessness but circumstance, not failure but adaptation. You sign your name with a flourish that costs you nothing but practice, and you seal the letter with wax that you've saved and reused so many times it's lost its original color. As you hand the letter to a maid for posting, you wonder if Mrs. Whitmore will notice the quality of the ink, the thinness of the paper, the signs of scarcity that your handwriting cannot quite hide. You wonder if she'll interpret these signs as evidence of poverty, which might count against you, or as evidence of thrift, which might count in your favor. You wonder, as you always wonder, whether this letter will be enough, whether your handwriting can overcome the limitations of your materials, whether the perfect script you've spent years developing can survive the imperfections of the world you inhabit. The maid takes the letter and disappears down the stairs, and you return to the nursery where the children are already arguing about something trivial, and you begin the endless work of teaching them to write, to form letters, to make their marks upon the world. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you're already calculating how to make your ink last, how to stretch your paper further, how to survive until that reply comes, if it comes, and changes everything, or nothing at all. You stand at the nursery window, watching the children play in the square below, and you try to understand why Charles resists handwriting lessons with such fierce determination. He's not a lazy child. He throws himself into mathematics with real enthusiasm, and he'll spend hours with his geography books, tracing maps and memorizing capitals. But the moment you bring out the slates and chalk, or heaven forbid the pen and paper, his whole demeanor shifts. His shoulders hunch, his jaw tightens, and he develops 1,000 small excuses to avoid the task. His chalk is broken, his nib is scratchy, he needs to use the water closet, he's sure he hears his mother calling. You've tried everything you can think of. You've praised his small successes, hoping encouragement might work where criticism failed. You've been patient with his struggles, demonstrating the same stroke dozens of times without visible frustration. You've even tried bribing him with extra playtime when his letters show improvement. Nothing penetrates the wall of resistance he's built around this one subject, and you're running out of ideas. This afternoon, watching him chase Amelia around the square while Eleanor sits properly on a bench with a book, you think you finally understand. Charles isn't resisting handwriting because he finds it difficult, though he does. He isn't resisting because he's lazy, though he can be. He's resisting because handwriting, for him, represents everything he's being trained to become, and he's not sure he wants to become that person. The person Charles is being shaped to be is a gentleman, a future master of households and employer of governesses, a man who will write letters of reference rather than receive them, who will evaluate handwriting rather than be evaluated by it. And the handwriting he's learning, the copperplate script you're drilling into his reluctant fingers, is the script of that class, the uniform in which gentlemen clothe their thoughts when they present them to the world. By teaching him to write this way, you're teaching him to belong to a class you can never join, to master a skill that marks him as superior to you even as you're the one imparting it. You've known this intellectually, of course, from your first day as a governess. The paradox of your position is that you're employed to make yourself unnecessary, to train children to surpass you, to give them skills that will place them forever beyond your reach. But watching Charles run in the square, watching his unself-conscious joy in movement, you feel the weight of that paradox in a new way. He doesn't want to sit still and form perfect letters because sitting still and forming perfect letters means accepting the cage he'll live in for the rest of his life. The cage of gentlemanly behavior, of controlled expression, of always presenting a carefully crafted surface to the world. And you, by teaching him handwriting, are helping to build that cage. The surprising historical insight that colors your understanding is that 19th century handwriting instruction was explicitly understood as moral and social training, not merely technical skill. The copybooks children used were filled not with neutral text but with maxims carefully chosen to instill proper values. Honesty is the best policy. A penny saved is a penny earned. Courtesy costs nothing. Every time Charles copied these phrases, he was meant to internalize not just the letter forms but the sentiments they expressed. The physical act of writing was supposed to etch these values into his character as surely as the ink etched them onto the page. You wonder, sometimes, whether it works. Whether the hours Charles spends copying moral maxims actually shape his character, or whether he simply learns to form the letters while the meaning slides past him unabsorbed. You wonder whether your own years of handwriting practice have shaped you, whether the discipline and control you've developed have actually made you a better person or merely a more employable one. The theory is seductive, that beautiful handwriting reflects a beautiful soul, but your experience suggests something more complicated, that beautiful handwriting can also hide a desperate one, that the most elegant script sometimes flows from the most anxious hand. Eleanor, at least, seems to understand the stakes. She practices her letters with a determination that sometimes frightens you, pressing so hard on her pen that the nib scratches against the paper, forming each stroke with an intensity that suggests she's fighting something. You've seen this before in girls her age, the dawning awareness that handwriting matters for them in ways it doesn't for their brothers, that their letters will be judged more harshly, that their opportunities depend more completely on presenting a perfect surface to the world. Charles can resist handwriting because he'll inherit property and position regardless of his penmanship. Eleanor cannot afford to resist, because her future depends entirely on how she's perceived. This difference, this fundamental inequality in what handwriting means for boys and for girls, shapes every moment of your teaching. You push Eleanor harder because you know she needs it, because the world will be less forgiving of her imperfections. You're gentler with Charles because you know he has options, because his resistance costs him less than compliance would cost you. And you watch Amelia, only 6, already forming her letters with a care that seems instinctive, and you wonder what she understands already about the role handwriting will play in her life. Historians still argue whether the Victorian educational system deliberately prepared girls and boys for different futures through handwriting instruction, or whether the differential outcomes simply reflected broader social patterns. From your position at the nursery table, watching the children struggle with the same exercises for different reasons, the answer seems obvious. Of course it was deliberate. Everything about their education points toward their destined places in the social order. The subjects they study, the books they read, the very way they are taught to hold their pens. Charles learns to write so he can manage his estate and conduct business. Eleanor learns to write so she can produce elegant letters and keep household accounts. Both learn the same script, but it means something different for each of them. You call the children in from their play as the afternoon light begins to fade. They come reluctantly, Charles dragging his feet, Eleanor composed as always, Amelia still clutching a flower she's picked in the square. You settle them at the nursery table with their slates and chalk, and you begin the afternoon handwriting lesson with a sigh you can't quite suppress. Today's maxim, from the copybook you're using, is patience is a virtue. You write it on the board in your finest copperplate, demonstrating the proper formation of each letter, the correct spacing between words, the graceful curve of the final comma. Charles groans audibly. Eleanor bends to her slate with that frightening intensity. Amelia traces the letters in the air with her finger before attempting them on her slate. And as you watch them work, you think about what patience means for each of them. For Charles, patience means enduring this tedious lesson until he can escape to more interesting pursuits. For Eleanor, patience means practicing hour after hour, year after year, building a skill that may never bring her joy but might bring her security. For Amelia, patience means learning now what she'll need later, trusting that these tedious exercises serve some purpose she can't yet understand. For you, patience means continuing to teach them, continuing to form perfect letters on the board, continuing to demonstrate strokes you've demonstrated 1,000 times before, all while knowing that your reward for this patience will be their eventual departure, their movement into worlds where you cannot follow. You will teach Charles to write elegantly, and he will grow up to employ governesses who write less elegantly than he does. You will teach Eleanor to write beautifully, and she will become a lady who evaluates the handwriting of the governesses she hires for her own children. You will teach Amelia to write carefully, and she will become someone you'll never know, someone whose handwriting you helped shape but whose life you'll never see. This is the patience of the governess, the patience to invest in futures you won't share, to build skills you'll never benefit from, to pour yourself into children who will forget your name. And you do it anyway, day after day, because this is your work, your calling, your strange and lonely profession. You do it because the alternative is nothing, no position, no purpose, no place in the world. You do it because patience, for you, is not just a virtue but a survival strategy, the only way to endure a life spent preparing others for lives you cannot have. Charles finishes his slate and holds it up for your inspection. The letters are uneven, the spacing inconsistent, but you can see improvement, real improvement, hard-won through resistance and effort. You praise him genuinely, and for a moment his face lights up with something that might be pride. Then his office chair and running, escaping back to the world of movement and play, leaving his slate behind with its imperfect maxim about patience. You wonder if he'll remember any of this when he's grown. You wonder if the hours you've spent shaping his handwriting will matter in the life he eventually lives. You wonder, as you always wonder, whether any of this matters at all. Then you pick up his slate, wipe it clean, and prepare for the next lesson. Because that's what patience means, in the end. You keep going. The house settles into darkness around you, that particular quiet that falls after midnight when even the servants have retreated to their attic beds and the only sounds are the settling of old timbers and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the square. You sit at your small desk, a single candle burning beside you. Your own candle, purchased with your own money, because using household candles after hours would be noted and mentioned and held against you somehow. The flame flickers in a draft you can't locate, casting jumping shadows across the page, and you squint against the inadequate light because you cannot afford better and because you have no choice. This is when you truly practice. Not in the morning, when anyone might walk in and see you working. Not during the children's lessons, when your handwriting must serve as demonstration. But here, in the deep hours of night, when the household sleeps and you are finally, blessedly alone with your pen and paper and the desperate need to improve. Your hand moves across the page, forming stroke after stroke, but tonight something is wrong. Your letters are trembling, the lines wavering in ways they shouldn't, and you know it's not the candlelight playing tricks on your eyes, it's your hand itself, your treacherous hand that has served you so faithfully for years, suddenly betraying you with shakes you cannot control. You set down the pen and flex your fingers, stretch your wrist, shake out your arm, but when you pick up the pen again, the tremor returns. You've been pushing too hard. You know this intellectually, the long days teaching, the evenings mending, the nights practicing, all on too little food and too little sleep and too much anxiety about the future. Your body is telling you what your mind has tried to ignore, that you cannot continue this way, that something must give, that even the most disciplined hand has limits. But what choice do you have? If your handwriting deteriorates, you lose your position. If you lose your position, you lose everything, your home, your income, your tenuous hold on respectability. There is no safety net for women like you, no family to take you in, no alternative profession waiting. There is only this, the pen, the paper, the endless practice, and the hope that you can hold yourself together long enough to secure the next position before this one crumbles. The tremor in your hand terrifies you in ways you can't fully articulate. It's not just a physical symptom, it's evidence that you're failing, that you're not strong enough, that all those years of discipline and control have built something that can still be shattered by exhaustion and fear. You think about the governess you met in the park, the one who told you about being dismissed when her handwriting deteriorated during an illness. You understand her story differently now, understanding how it must have felt to watch her own hand betray her, to know that her body's weakness would be read as moral failure, as evidence that she was letting herself go. You try again, gripping the pen tighter as if you can force the tremor away through sheer will. The resulting letters are worse, the pressure too heavy, the strokes thickened into clumsiness, the whole page a testament to your desperation. You tow it from the book and crumple it, then force yourself to stop, to breathe, to think. The candle sputters, burning low, and you realize you've been sitting here for hours without making any progress. Your hand still shakes, though perhaps slightly less than before. Your eyes ache from straining in the dim light. Your back protests the hard chair, the hours of sitting, the accumulated fatigue of days and weeks and months of this existence. And still, you cannot stop. Because stopping means giving up, and giving up means the workhouse, means the street, means all the fates that haunt the dreams of every governess who lies awake at night calculating how long her savings would last if the worst happened. You've heard the stories. Governesses who ended in asylums, who took their own lives, who disappeared into the vast underclass of desperate women for whom Victorian society had no use and no sympathy. You will not become one of them. You cannot. So you light another candle, your last one, the one you'd been saving for emergencies, and you begin again. This time you start with the basic drills, the ovals and loops that require less fine control, that let your hand warm gradually into the work. You focus on your breathing, on relaxing your shoulder, on letting the movement flow from somewhere deeper than the tremor. And slowly, gradually, your hand steadies. The surprising historical detail that gives you a sliver of comfort is that you're not alone in this midnight struggle. Governesses across England, in countless nurseries and schoolrooms, are sitting at this very moment with their candles and their pens, practicing in secret, fighting the same battle against exhaustion and despair. You'll never meet most of them, never know their names or see their faces, but you're connected to them through this shared experience. The hidden labor, the desperate practice, the determination to maintain the skills that keep you all employed. It's not exactly solidarity, not in any organized sense, but it's something. A recognition that you're part of a silent army of women fighting the same war. Your hand moves more smoothly now, the tremor reduced to a faint shiver you can almost ignore. You work through the entire alphabet, uppercase and lowercase, then move on to common words and phrases. You practice your signature over and over, that most important combination of letters, the one that must always be perfect because it appears on every letter you write, every application you submit, every document that carries your identity into the world. By the time the second candle burns low, your hand has steadied completely. You've filled several pages with your finest script, and you sit back to examine them with the critical eye you've developed over years of self-assessment. The letters are good, not your very best work, perhaps, but solid, professional, worthy of a governess who takes her responsibilities seriously. Nobody looking at these pages would guess the struggle that produced them. Nobody would know about the tremor, the fear, the desperate midnight battle against your own body's limits. This is the skill that matters most, you realize. Not just forming beautiful letters, but hiding the effort it takes to form them. Presenting a surface of effortless grace while underneath you're fighting for survival. Making it look easy when nothing about your life is easy. You blow out the candle stub and sit in darkness for a moment, listening to the house settle around you. Somewhere below, a maid coughs in her sleep. Somewhere above, the wind rattles a loose window. And here, in your small room, you sit with your pages of perfect script and your aching hand and your exhausted body, and you wonder how many more nights like this you can survive. The answer, you know, is as many as it takes. Because the alternative is unthinkable, and because you've come too far to stop now, and because somewhere out there, in a drawing room you've never seen, a lady is holding a letter you wrote and deciding your future based on the curve of your capital letters. That letter must be perfect. All your letters must be perfect. And if perfection costs you sleep and health and peace of mind, that's simply the price of survival in a world that has no place for imperfect women. You crawl into bed as the first gray light begins to seep through your window, and you sleep the sleep of complete exhaustion, your hand twitching occasionally as if still forming letters in your dreams. In a few hours, you'll wake and begin again. The children, the lessons, the constant performance of competence. And tomorrow night, if your hand trembles again, you'll light another candle and practice until it steadies. Because that's what you do. That's who you've become. That's the life you're living, one perfect letter at a time. You're mending a torn pinafore in the weak afternoon light when the mistress sends for you, and your heart seizes with that familiar dread that never quite goes away no matter how many times you've been summoned. You set down your needle, smooth your dress, and walk the long corridor to her sitting room with the careful composure that years of practice have taught you, even as your mind races through every possible reason for this summons and every possible outcome that might follow. By the time you reach her door, you've composed your face into calm attention, but your hands, your treacherous hands, are trembling slightly, and you clasp them together to still them before you enter. She's seated at her writing desk, a beautiful piece of furniture in rosewood that you've glimpsed through open doors but never examined closely. Before her is a letter, and as you approach, you see that it's written in your hand, a letter you wrote weeks ago, applying for a position in another household, a letter you thought had been sent and forgotten. But here it is, in your mistress's hands, and your stomach drops because you understand immediately what this means. She looks up at you with an expression you can't read, not angry, exactly, but curious, assessing, as if she's seen you for the first time. "Sit down," she says, gesturing to a chair, and you obey because you have no choice, because the power dynamics of this household have just shifted in ways you don't yet understand. "I received this letter by accident," she says, holding it up. "It was delivered to my desk rather than to the recipients, a postal error that will be corrected. But before I return it to the post, I find myself curious about something." You wait, saying nothing, because anything you say might be wrong. She studies the letter, then you, then the letter again. "Your handwriting is remarkable," she says finally. "I've seen you write, of course, lesson plans, notes to the housekeeper, that sort of thing. But this letter shows a level of care, of artistry, that I hadn't fully appreciated. The way you've formed the capital letters, the consistency of the slant, the perfect spacing, it's truly beautiful work." You murmur your thanks, unsure where this is leading, still braced for criticism or dismissal. "How many hours," she asks, "did you spend practicing to achieve this?" The question catches you off guard, and for a moment you can't answer. How many hours? Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands, perhaps. Years of early mornings and late nights, of aching hands and tired eyes, of paper hoarded and ink carefully conserved. But you can't say that, can't reveal the desperation behind the beauty, can't let her see how much this skill has cost you. "Many hours, madam," you say carefully. "I've practiced since childhood." She nods slowly, still studying the letter. "My own governess, when I was a girl, had handwriting much like yours. I remember watching her write and thinking it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The way the letters seemed to flow from her pen without effort, each one perfect, each one exactly where it should be. I tried to imitate her, of course, but I never came close." She smiles slightly, a private memory surfacing. "She told me once that handwriting reveals character, that the way we form our letters shows who we truly are. Do you believe that?" It's a trap, you realize, or at least a test, though you're not sure what answer she's seeking. Do you believe that handwriting reveals character? If you say yes, you're claiming that your perfect script proves your moral worth, a claim that might seem prideful. If you say no, you're dismissing a theory that many Victorians hold sacred, including perhaps your mistress herself. "I believe," you say slowly, "that handwriting reveals the character we wish to have. The discipline and care we bring to our letters can shape who we become, even if we don't start with those qualities naturally." She considers this, then nods. A diplomatic answer. And perhaps a true one. She sets the letter down and looks at you directly. "I know you're seeking another position. I'm not offended. I understand that a governess must always look ahead, must always secure her future. But seeing this letter, seeing the quality of your work, makes me wonder whether I've fully appreciated what I have in this household. You don't know what to say. You've never had a conversation like this with her, never been addressed as anything approaching an equal, never been invited to discuss your work as if it mattered. I've been thinking, she continues, about my daughter's education. Eleanor is approaching the age where she'll need more than basic instruction. She'll need to present herself to the world as a young lady, and her handwriting will be part of that presentation. I've been considering engaging a specialist to work with her on penmanship, but perhaps that's unnecessary. Perhaps I already have someone in my household who could do this work. Your mind races. Is she offering you something? A new role, additional responsibilities, perhaps even more security? Or is she simply thinking aloud, testing possibilities that may never materialize? What would you need, she asks, to bring Eleanor's handwriting to the level of yours? How many hours of instruction, what kind of practice, what materials? You answer carefully, drawing on years of experience teaching children to write, explaining the progression from basic strokes to full letters, the importance of daily practice, the materials that would be required. She listens attentively, asking questions that show she's genuinely interested, that she's thought about this before. And as you talk, you realize that something is shifting between you, that she's seeing you differently, valuing you differently, perhaps even respecting you in a way she hasn't before. The surprising historical insight that colors this moment is that Victorians genuinely believed handwriting revealed moral character, not just in theory, but as a practical tool for evaluating people. Employers studied handwriting samples before hiring servants. Young people chose marriage partners partly based on penmanship. Bankers examined signatures for signs of dishonesty. Your handwriting wasn't just a skill. It was you, made visible on the page, available for anyone to read and judge. And your mistress, studying your letter, believes she's seen your soul. She believes the discipline and beauty of your script prove your worth as a person, your fitness to educate her daughter, your moral standing in a world where women like you have little standing at all. It's not true, of course, or not entirely true. Your handwriting reflects years of desperate practice, not innate virtue. But the belief that it reflects virtue is what matters here, what might secure your position, what might transform your future. You leave the sitting room an hour later with a new understanding of your place in this household. Your mistress hasn't made any promises, hasn't offered any formal change in your position, but she's seen you, really seen you, for perhaps the first time. And she's seen you through your handwriting, through those perfect letters that cost you so much, through the surface you've worked so hard to create. Back in the nursery, Eleanor is practicing her letters with that frightening intensity, and you watch her differently now, understanding that she's not just learning a skill but building an identity, creating the handwriting that will represent her to the world for the rest of her life. You think about what your mistress said, that handwriting reveals character, and you wonder what Eleanor's handwriting reveals about her. The fierce pressure of her pen, the determination in every stroke, the way she corrects and recorrects each imperfect letter. It reveals a girl who's fighting something, who's determined to be perfect, who's already learned that the surface matters more than anything beneath it. You sit beside her and gently adjust her grip on the pen, showing her how to relax her hand, how to let the letters flow rather than forcing them onto the page. She resists at first, then slowly, gradually, her hand softens, and her writing improves, not in technique, but in quality, in the indefinable something that separates mechanical copying from true penmanship. There, you say quietly, "That's beautiful work." She looks at the page, then at you, and for a moment you see something in her eyes that might be trust, might be respect, might be the beginning of something you've never quite had with any of your pupils. Then she looks away, back to her letters, and the moment passes. But you remember it. You remember it hours later, lying in your bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what comes next. You remember it as you drift toward sleep, your hand still aching from the day's work, your mind still turning over the conversation in the sitting room. You remember it as you dream of letters flowing endlessly across pages, each one perfect, each one you. The letter arrives on a Thursday, tucked among the morning post that the butler distributes with his usual disdainful efficiency, and you know immediately that something is different because he hands it to you directly rather than leaving it on the hall table with the servants' correspondence. You take it with steady hands and a calm expression, waiting until you've reached the privacy of the nursery before you examine it. The creamy paper, the elegant handwriting of the address, the wax seal pressed with a crest you don't recognize. It's from Mrs. Whitmore, the lady from Derbyshire who visited weeks ago, and as you break the seal and unfold the paper, your heart pounds with that mixture of hope and fear that accompanies every letter that might change your life. You read it once quickly, then again slowly, then a third time to be certain you haven't misunderstood. She offers you the position. She wants you to come to Derbyshire as governess to her 2 daughters, with a modest increase in salary and the promise of a private sitting room of your own. She mentions, almost as an aside, that your handwriting convinced her of your suitability, that she showed your letter to her husband, who agreed that anyone who wrote so beautifully must possess the refinement and discipline required for the position. You sit down heavily, the letter trembling in your hands, and you try to absorb what this means. A new position, a new household, a new chance at the precarious stability you've spent your whole adult life pursuing. More money, more privacy, more respect, at least potentially. And all because of your handwriting, because of those hours of practice, because of the perfect letters you formed on a page months ago, never imagining they would travel so far or matter so much. But even as joy bubbles up inside you, something else stirs, a complicated awareness that this letter, this offer, comes with its own dangers. You'll have to leave this household, these children you've grown to care about despite yourself. You'll have to travel alone to a county you've never visited, enter a household where you know no one, begin again the endless work of establishing yourself, proving yourself, making yourself indispensable to people who have no reason to trust you. And you'll have to do it all while maintaining that perfect handwriting, that flawless surface, that constant performance of competence that has brought you this far. The children notice something different about you that afternoon. You're distracted, your attention wandering during lessons, your corrections less precise than usual. Charles takes advantage shamelessly, producing sloppy work that would normally earn a sharp word. Eleanor watches you with those knowing eyes, sensing that something has shifted but not yet understanding what. Even little Amelia seems confused by your inattention, looking up from her slate with a worried frown. You pull yourself together as best you can, but your mind keeps drifting back to the letter, to Derbyshire, to the unknown future that now stretches before you. By the time the children are handed over to nurse for their evening walk, you've made a decision. You'll accept the position, of course. You'd be a fool not to. But you'll do it carefully, thoughtfully, in a way that preserves your relationships here and sets you up for success there. That evening, you write your acceptance letter with the most careful hand you can manage, using your best paper and your best ink, forming each letter with the precision of years of practice. You thank Mrs. Whitmore for her confidence in you, accept her terms, and propose a starting date that gives you time to complete your duties here and make the journey north. You seal it with your own small seal, a gift from your mother years ago, one of your few possessions of any value, and you give it to the maid with strict instructions to post it first thing in the morning. Then you sit in the gathering darkness, watching the last light fade from the nursery windows, and you think about what you've just done. You've committed yourself to a new life, a new household, new children to teach and new employers to please. You've chosen uncertainty over the familiar discomfort of your current position. You've trusted your handwriting, that skill you've spent years developing, to carry you into a future you cannot see. The surprising historical detail that occurs to you now is that letters like this one, acceptance letters, reference letters, letters of introduction, were the primary mechanism through which Victorian governesses navigated their careers. There were no employment agencies, no formal qualifications, no standardized credentials. There was only the network of correspondence, the endless flow of letters that carried reputations and opportunities across counties, that connected desperate women with uncertain households, that built and destroyed careers based on the quality of a single sheet of paper. Your letter will travel north by coach, passing through towns you've never seen, carried by hands that will never know your name. It will arrive in Derbyshire and be opened by Mrs. Whitmore, who will read it and show it to her husband, who will nod approvingly at the handwriting that convinced them both of your worth. And then, weeks from now, you will follow that letter. You will travel the same route, pass through the same towns, arrive at the same door, and begin the work of becoming the person your handwriting has promised you are. But first, you have to tell your current mistress that you're leaving. And that conversation, you suspect, will be more complicated than the letter that prompted it. You find her the next morning in her sitting room, and this time you're the one with a letter to show, Mrs. Whitmore's offer, which you've brought to demonstrate that you're not leaving on a whim, that you have a legitimate opportunity that any governess would be wise to accept. Your mistress reads it carefully, her expression unreadable, and when she looks up, you can't tell whether she's angry or sad or simply resigned. "I see," she says quietly. "Derbyshire is far." "Yes, madam. And the salary is slightly better than what I pay you." "Yes, madam." She sets the letter down and looks at you with an expression you can't quite interpret. "You understand that I could match it. If I wanted to keep you, I could offer the same terms." You hadn't considered this possibility. Could she? Would she? The idea of staying here, but with better pay and perhaps more respect, is suddenly very appealing. You know these children, this household, this routine. You know which servants to avoid and which to cultivate. You know where the best light falls for writing and which chair in the nursery doesn't creak. Leaving all that for the unknown of Derbyshire suddenly seems less obviously wise. "But I won't," she continues, and your hope deflates as quickly as it rose. Not because you don't deserve it, but because matching another household's offer would set a precedent I can't afford. If I raise your salary to keep you, every servant in this house will angle for the same treatment. The cook will demand more because the housekeeper got a bonus. The maids will want raises because you got one. It's a cascade I can't start. You nod, because you understand, you do understand, even as disappointment settles in your chest. This is the logic of households, the careful economy that governs every aspect of domestic life. You're not just a person, you're a line item in a budget, a position in a hierarchy, a precedent that might be cited by others. "I'll give you an excellent reference," she says, and her voice is kinder now. "And I'll write to a cousin of mine who lives near Mrs. Whitmore, ask her to keep an eye on you, help you settle in. You've been a good governess to my children, and I want you to succeed." You thank her, and you mean it. A reference from a lady of her standing, combined with your handwriting and your experience, should secure your position in Derbyshire and perhaps beyond. It's more than many governesses receive when they leave a household, more than you dared to hope for, really. The next few weeks pass in a blur of preparations and farewells. You pack your few possessions carefully, wrap your pens and nibs in soft cloth, secure your ink bottles in a box where they won't break during the journey. You say goodbye to the servants you've worked alongside for years, receiving everything from genuine warmth to barely concealed relief at your departure. You spend your last afternoons with the children, teaching them with a gentleness that comes from knowing you'll soon be gone, watching them with new eyes as you memorize their faces, their voices, the particular way each of them holds a pen. Charles gives you a drawing he's made, a crude sketch of the nursery, with stick figures that are supposed to be you and him and Eleanor and Amelia. It's the most precious gift you've ever received, and you tuck it carefully into your trunk, knowing you'll keep it forever. Eleanor writes you a letter, in her best handwriting, thanking you for teaching her and promising to practice every day. Her letters are still slightly uneven, still show the strain of her fierce determination, but they are beautiful in their own way. Beautiful because she made them, because she tried, because she cared. On your last morning, you stand at the nursery window one final time, watching the square below where you've spent so many afternoons supervising play. The trees are beginning to turn, leaves edging toward the gold and red of autumn, and you wonder what autumn looks like in Derbyshire, whether the hills you've heard about will be as beautiful as everyone says. Then you pick up your bag, smooth your dress, and walk out of the nursery for the last time. The carriage awaits below, and the butler, surprisingly, helps you with your trunk. The maid who brought you tea each morning waves from the area steps. And as the carriage pulls away, you look back at the house where you've spent years of your life, and you wonder if you'll ever see it again, if the children will remember you, if any of it mattered at all. Then you face forward, toward Derbyshire, toward the unknown, toward the future your handwriting has earned you. The carriage rattles through London streets, and you clutch your bag with the letter from Mrs. Whitmore tucked safely inside, and you let yourself hope. The journey to Derbyshire takes 2 days by coach, and you spend most of it with your hands folded in your lap, watching the landscape change from city streets to sprawling suburbs to countryside that grows wilder and more beautiful with each passing mile. You've never traveled this far from London, never seen hills like these or skies so wide, and despite your anxiety about what awaits you, there's something exhilarating about the movement, the progress, the sense of leaving behind everything familiar and hurtling towards something new. The coach stops at inns along the way, and you take your meals alone at small tables while other passengers chat and laugh around you. You're used to solitude, used to being the one who doesn't quite belong. But here, among strangers who have no reason to notice you, the solitude feels different, less like exclusion and more like freedom. Nobody here knows you're a governess. Nobody here is judging your clothes or your manners or your handwriting. For these few hours, you're simply a woman traveling, and that anonymity is its own kind of gift. By the second afternoon, the landscape has shifted again, greener now, with stone walls dividing fields and hills rising in the distance. The air feels different, sharper, carrying scents of earth and sheep and something you can't identify. When the coach finally rattles into the village where Mrs. Whitmore's carriage awaits, you step down with stiff legs and a heart pounding with anticipation. The carriage takes you through the village and up a long drive lined with trees just beginning to show autumn color. And then you see it, the house, which is more of a small manor really, built of grey stone with mullioned windows and ivy climbing one wall. It's beautiful in a way the London townhouse never was, settled into the landscape as if it grew there, as if it's always been part of this valley and always will be. Mrs. Whitmore greets you at the door with a warmth that surprises you, taking your hands and drawing you inside, exclaiming over your journey and your health and your first impressions of Derbyshire. She introduces you to the housekeeper, a Mrs. Elkins who seems efficient and kind, and to the 2 little girls who will be your pupils, Margaret, age 9, and Catherine, age 7, both staring at you with the open curiosity of children who haven't yet learned to hide their feelings. Your room is on the 2nd floor, not in the nursery wing but in a small corridor that seems to be reserved for upper servants and long-term guests. It's larger than your London room, with a window that looks out over the hills, and there's a writing desk, a real writing desk, with drawers and cubbies and a surface smooth from years of use. Mrs. Elkins tells you it belonged to the previous governess, who retired after 30 years in this household, and you feel a strange sense of connection to this woman you'll never meet, this woman who sat at this same desk and looked out this same window and wrote letters in a hand you'll never see. You unpack your few possessions carefully, arranging your pens and ink on the desk, placing Charles' drawing where you can see it from your bed. Then you sit at the desk for the first time, running your hand over its surface, and you feel something you haven't felt in years, the possibility of permanence. 30 years. The previous governess stayed here for 30 years. Could you do the same? Could this house, this room, this desk become yours in a way no place has ever been? The first weeks in any new household are always difficult, and this one is no exception. You have to learn the rhythms of the house, the preferences of the children, the expectations of Mrs. Whitmore and her husband, who appears occasionally but seems largely content to leave domestic matters to his wife. You have to establish your authority with Margaret and Catherine, who are well behaved enough but test boundaries in the way children always do. You have to navigate the complex social landscape of the servants' hall, where you're neither quite servant nor quite family and where your position must be constantly negotiated and defended. But through it all, you have your handwriting, that constant companion, that reliable skill, that performance of competence that never fails you. When Mrs. Whitmore asks you to write a note to a neighbor, you produce it in your finest copperplate and watch her face light with satisfaction. When Margaret struggles with her letters, you demonstrate the strokes with a patience that comes from years of practice. When you write to your mother, describing your new situation, you fill the pages with beautiful script that will reassure her that her daughter is safe, is settled, is doing well. The surprising historical detail that emerges during these first weeks is that Mrs. Whitmore's household has its own handwriting culture, expectations about script that differ subtly from what you're used to. The previous governess wrote in a slightly old-fashioned hand, with more flourishes than modern taste prefers, and Mrs. Whitmore has grown accustomed to that style. She doesn't criticize your copperplate, doesn't suggest you change, but you notice that she pauses slightly when reading your letters, as if adjusting to a different visual rhythm. You begin to adapt, as you've learned to adapt in every household. You study old letters in the schoolroom, written by the previous governess, and you practice imitating her style, the particular way she formed her capital letters, the slight slant variation that distinguished her hand. Not because anyone has asked you to, but because you've learned that success as a governess means becoming what each household needs, fitting yourself to their expectations, making your handwriting, and yourself, invisible in its perfect appropriateness. Margaret's handwriting is already quite good for her age, thanks to the previous governess's careful instruction, but she lacks confidence. She second-guesses every stroke, hesitates before forming each letter, produces work that's technically correct but somehow lifeless. You work with her on fluency, on letting the letters flow rather than constructing them piece by piece, on trusting her hand to remember what her mind has taught it. Slowly, gradually, her writing improves, not just in appearance but in character, developing a personality that's uniquely hers. Catherine is younger, less disciplined, more interested in running and playing than in sitting still with a pen. You have to work harder to engage her, to make handwriting lessons feel like games rather than chores. You invent competitions and challenges, reward improvements with small privileges, find ways to sneak practice into activities she already enjoys. It's exhausting, but it works. Slowly, her letters begin to take shape, her hand begins to remember the strokes, her resistance begins to soften. And through it all, you practice. Every morning before the children wake, every evening after they sleep, you sit at your beautiful desk with your window looking out over the hills and you write. Ovals and loops, ascenders and descenders, whole pages of text that you'll never show anyone. Because this skill is not just for them, it's for you, for your survival, for the future you're building one perfect letter at a time. One evening, about a month into your new position, Mrs. Whitmore knocks on your door, a courtesy that surprises you, that suggests a respect you're not accustomed to receiving. She's holding a letter, and her expression is troubled. "I wonder if you might help me with something," she says, and you invite her in, Offer her the chair by your window while you sit at the desk. She explains that she's received a letter from her sister, who lives in Scotland, and the handwriting is so difficult to read that she can't make out several crucial passages. Her sister has never had good penmanship. It's a family joke, apparently. But age has made it worse, and now Mrs. Whitmore finds herself unable to decipher whole sentences. I thought, she says hesitantly, that with your expertise in handwriting, you might be able to help. To read it, I mean, or perhaps to suggest how I might respond in a way that encourages her to write more clearly without offending her. You take the letter and study it. The handwriting is indeed difficult, cramped and spiky, with letters formed inconsistently and words running together. But you've spent years reading children's early attempts at writing, years deciphering the nearly illegible scrawls of beginners, and you find that you can make out most of it with careful attention. You read it aloud to Mrs. Whitmore, translating the difficult passages, and she listens with growing relief, laughing at some sections, sighing at others. When you finish, she looks at you with an expression you can't quite name. You have a gift, she says quietly. Not just for writing beautifully, but for reading what others write. For understanding the person behind the pen. You don't know what to say. You've never thought of it that way, never considered that your years of studying handwriting might give you insight into the people who produce it. But perhaps she's right. Perhaps all those hours of practice, all that attention to the nuances of script, have taught you something beyond mere technique. Would you help me with my reply? She asks. I want to write to her, but I don't want to hurt her feelings. Perhaps you could suggest how to phrase it, or even write it in a hand she might find easier to read. You agree, of course. And as you sit together, drafting a letter to a sister you'll never meet, you realize that something has shifted in your relationship with Mrs. Whitmore. She's not just your employer anymore, she's something closer to a colleague, a partner in this strange work of communication through written words. And that shift, small as it seems, changes everything. The first time you hear about the typewriter, you're in the village posting letters, and the postmistress mentions it casually, a new machine she's read about in the newspapers, one that writes letters mechanically, producing perfect script without any human hand guiding the pen. You laugh politely, assuming she's exaggerating, but she insists it's real, shows you an illustrated article with a drawing of a strange contraption covered in keys, and you stare at it with a mixture of disbelief and something you don't want to name. A machine that writes. A machine that produces perfect letters without years of practice, without aching hands, without the endless discipline of penmanship. A machine that could make everything you've worked for irrelevant. You walk back to the house slowly, the article's image burned into your memory, and you try to push away the fear that's curling in your stomach. It's just a novelty, surely. A toy for wealthy men who enjoy mechanical gadgets. It could never replace the human touch, the character revealed in handwriting, the personal connection that flows from pen to paper. Could it? But the seed is planted, and it grows. Over the following weeks and months, you hear more about these typewriting machines. They're being used in businesses now, in offices, producing documents faster than any human hand could write. There are schools teaching people to operate them, mostly men but some women too. There's even a word for the people who run them, typists. You try not to think about what this means for you. You try to focus on your work, on Margaret and Catherine, on the daily rhythm of lessons and practice that has defined your life for so long. But the fear lingers, surfacing at unexpected moments, when you're practicing your copperplate in the early morning, when you're teaching the girls to form their letters, when you're writing letters of your own and wondering if anyone will care about beautiful handwriting in a world of mechanical script. The surprising historical detail that eventually reaches you is that these typewriting machines were originally designed for blind people, to allow them to write without needing to see the page. The first practical typewriter, developed by Christopher Latham Scholes in the 1860s, was intended to help a blind friend create legible documents. Only later did businessmen realize that machines could write faster than humans, that mechanical script could be more efficient than even the finest copperplate. You find this detail oddly comforting, that the machine threatening your profession began as a tool of compassion, an aid for those who couldn't see to write. It doesn't change the threat, doesn't make it less real, but it reminds you that technology isn't malicious, isn't aimed at you personally. It's just progress, moving forward whether you're ready or not. Mrs. Whitmore mentions the typewriter one evening when you're working together on correspondence. She's read about them too, and she's curious, wondering whether they might be useful for household accounts, for the endless letters she writes to family and friends. You keep your voice neutral as you discuss it, asking questions, offering opinions, never letting her see how the conversation makes you feel. It would be faster, she muses, but would it be as personal? A letter written by machine seems somehow cold, doesn't it? As if the writer couldn't be bothered to put pen to paper. You agree, perhaps too quickly, and she gives you a curious look but says nothing. Later, alone in your room, you wonder if she suspects, if she understands that this machine threatens everything you are, everything you've built. Probably not. Why would she? To her, handwriting is a pleasure, a choice, an optional refinement. She doesn't depend on it for survival. The weeks pass, and the typewriter recedes slightly in your thoughts, not forgotten, but pushed aside by the demands of daily life. Margaret's handwriting improves dramatically, and you're proud of her progress. Catherine finally stops fighting every lesson and begins to take pleasure in forming beautiful letters. Mrs. Whitmore relies on you more and more for correspondence, for reading difficult handwriting, for the thousand small tasks that require your particular skill. And then a letter arrives that changes everything. It's from your mother, written in her familiar, shaky hand. The hand that's grown less steady with age, that struggles now to form the letters she once wrote with ease. She tells you that your father's cousin has died, leaving a small legacy that will come to you, enough, perhaps, to make a difference in your circumstances. But the letter that matters isn't hers, it's the one enclosed with it, written by the solicitor handling the estate, and it's typed. You stare at the page, at the perfectly uniform letters, at the mechanical precision that no human hand could achieve. Each character is identical to every other character of the same kind. The spacing is exact, the alignment perfect, the whole document a testament to the machine that produced it. And you realize, with a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature, that this is what the future looks like. The solicitor's typed letter is easier to read than any handwritten document would be. It's faster to produce, more efficient, less prone to error. It carries no personal character, reveals nothing about the writer, but for legal matters, for business, for records, for the countless documents that keep the world running, that's precisely the point. You don't want personality in a legal document. You want precision, clarity, uniformity. And if machines can produce that precision, that clarity, that uniformity, what happens to the people who've spent their lives learning to produce it by hand? You write back to the solicitor in your finest copperplate, acknowledging the legacy and requesting further details. You're careful to make your handwriting perfect, to demonstrate that you're educated, refined, worthy of this unexpected inheritance. But even as you write, you wonder if the solicitor will notice your beautiful script, or if he'll simply process your letter alongside the typed documents flooding his office, dismissing your careful penmanship as obsolete. The legacy, when it finally arrives, is modest, enough to buy a few luxuries, to save against emergency, but not enough to change your life fundamentally. You use some of it to buy better paper, better ink, a new pen with a nib that glides across the page like silk. You tell yourself these are investments in your career, in the handwriting that sustains you. But part of you wonders if you're investing in a dying art, if the skills you've spent decades perfecting will soon be as obsolete as the quill pens your grandmother used. You don't share these fears with anyone. You continue to teach Margaret and Catherine, to assist Mrs. Whitmore with correspondence, to practice your copperplate in the early mornings and late evenings. You write letters to your mother, to former pupils, to the few friends you've made in this lonely profession. And you try not to think about the machine that writes without hands, without years of practice, without the soul that Victorians believe flows through every pen stroke. Historians still argue whether the typewriter truly displaced handwriting in Victorian society, or whether the two coexisted for decades, serving different purposes. From your perspective, in this Derbyshire manor in the 1880s, the answer seems clear. The machine is coming, and nothing will stop it. The only question is whether there will still be a place for you when it arrives. One evening, Margaret asks you why handwriting matters, when everyone knows about the new machines that can write faster and more neatly than any person. You pause, considering how to answer, and then you tell her what you believe, what you have to believe, to keep going. The machine can write, you say, but it can't express. It can't show the reader that the writer was tired or happy or in a hurry. It can't reveal character through the slant of letters or the pressure of the pen. A typed letter tells you what someone thought. A handwritten letter tells you who someone was. She considers this, her young face serious. So handwriting is like a portrait of the person. Something like that, you agree. Every time you write, you leave a little piece of yourself on the page. The machine can't do that. She nods, satisfied, and returns to her practice. But you wonder, as you watch her, whether she'll remember this conversation in 20 years, when machines have improved and multiplied and perhaps made your words irrelevant. You wonder whether her children will learn handwriting at all, or whether they'll simply type, producing perfect letters that reveal nothing about who they are. And you wonder, most of all, whether any of it matters. The hours of practice, the aching hands, the perfect copperplate that has defined your life. Whether, in the end, the machine will make everything you've done obsolete, and the world will move on without a backward glance at the women who spent their lives mastering a skill that no longer matters. But you don't stop practicing. You can't stop. Because this is who you are, what you do, the only identity you have. And even if the future belongs to machines, the present still requires your hand, your pen, your beautiful, obsolescent script. You stand in the drawing room of a grand house in the next county, your hands clasped before you, your face composed into pleasant attentiveness, while a woman you've never met examines you as if you're a piece of furniture she's considering purchasing. This is the inspection ritual, the interview for a new position, and you've performed it a dozen times before, but it never gets easier, never stops feeling like a transaction in which you're the product being evaluated. Lady Ashworth circles you slowly, taking in your dress, your posture, your hands, your face. She asks questions about your experience, your education, your references, and you answer them smoothly, having rehearsed these responses years ago until they became second nature. But you know, even as you speak, that the real evaluation hasn't begun yet. The real test is still to come. Would you be so kind, she says finally, gesturing toward a small writing desk in the corner, as to write a few lines for me? I find that a sample of handwriting tells me more about a person than any number of spoken answers. You've been waiting for this moment. You walk to the desk with measured steps, seat yourself gracefully, and arrange the paper, pen, and ink that have been provided. The paper is good quality, you note, smooth and cream-colored, the kind that shows copperplate to its best advantage. The ink is fresh and properly thick. The pen is unfamiliar, a make you haven't used before, but the nib seems responsive enough. Lady Ashworth dictates a short paragraph, a few lines from a novel, nothing difficult, and you begin to write. Your hand moves smoothly across the page, forming each letter with the precision of decades of practice. You don't have to think about the strokes anymore. Your muscles remember them, perform them automatically, while your conscious mind focuses on presenting the right image. Calm, competent, effortlessly skilled. But even as you write, you're aware that this is a performance, that Lady Ashworth is watching every movement, judging every detail. She's noting how you hold the pen, how you sit, how you move your arm across the page. She's studying the slant of your letters, the pressure of your strokes, the way you form your capital letters. And she's drawing conclusions from these observations, conclusions about your character, your education, your suitability for her household. You finish the paragraph, set down the pen, and rise. Lady Ashworth takes the page and studies it in silence for a long moment. Then she looks up at you with an expression you can't quite read. "Your handwriting is excellent," she says. "Truly excellent. But I notice a slight tremor in certain strokes. Just here, and here." She points to a few letters, and your heart sinks because you know she's right. You felt that tremor, suppressed it as best you could, but it still betrayed you. You explain, as calmly as you can, that you've been traveling, that you're tired from the journey, that your hand will steady with rest. Lady Ashworth listens politely, but you can see her calculating, weighing, deciding. The tremor, however slight, has registered as a mark against you, evidence, perhaps, of age or illness or nervousness, none of which are desirable in a governess. She thanks you for coming and tells you she'll be in touch. You know what that means. You'll never hear from her again. The journey back to Derbyshire is long and miserable, the coach crowded and the roads rough, and you spend the hours staring out the window at passing fields, replaying the interview in your mind, wondering if you could have done something differently. The tremor was barely perceptible, you're certain of that, but Lady Ashworth noticed it, and it cost you the position. One tiny imperfection, one moment of physical weakness, and everything you've worked for suddenly seems fragile. This is the reality of your profession. You're always being inspected, always being evaluated, always performing for an audience that can dismiss you at the first sign of imperfection. Every interview is a trial, every writing sample a test, every moment in a new household an audition for a role you never quite secure. And the smallest flaw, a tremor, a blot, a moment of hesitation, can undo years of careful work. The surprising historical detail that haunts you on this journey is that Victorian employers often used handwriting analysis as a form of character assessment that went far beyond mere penmanship. They believed that specific features of handwriting revealed specific character traits, that heavy pressure indicated sensuality, that wide spacing suggested generosity, that irregular slants meant emotional instability. Your slight tremor, to Lady Ashworth, might have signaled any number of undesirable qualities: nervousness, weakness, lack of self-control. It didn't matter that the tremor was physical, that you were tired from travel, that your hand normally performed perfectly. The interpretation was what mattered, and the interpretation had gone against you. Back at the Whitmore household, you try to put the interview out of your mind. There will be other positions, other opportunities. Your handwriting is still excellent, your references still strong, your experience still valuable. One rejection doesn't change any of that. But the tremor worries you. It's appeared before, on those nights of desperate practice, and you've always been able to control it, to hide it, to write through it until it passed. But what if it's getting worse? What if age or exhaustion or simply the accumulated strain of decades is catching up with you? What if the thing you've built your entire life around, the steady hand, the perfect script, is slowly failing? You practice more diligently than ever in the weeks that follow, rising even earlier, staying up even later, drilling the basic strokes until your hand aches and your eyes burn. You experiment with different pens, different papers, different inks, searching for the combination that minimizes the tremor. You try holding the pen differently, positioning your arm differently, breathing differently as you write. And slowly, gradually, you find that the tremor recedes, not disappears entirely, but becomes manageable, controllable, invisible to anyone who isn't looking for it. But you're always looking for it now. Every time you write, you're watching for that slight waver, that tiny imperfection, that evidence that your body is betraying you. You can hide it from others, but you can't hide it from yourself. The next interview comes 3 months later, at a household in the next county. This time you prepare differently, resting for a full day before the journey, sleeping as well as you can at the inn, arriving fresh and composed. When Lady Thornton asks you to provide a writing sample, your hand is steady, your letters perfect, your performance flawless. She offers you the position, and you accept. The household is smaller than the Whitmores, the children younger and less advanced in their studies, but the salary is good and the rooms comfortable. You settle in, establish your routine, begin the endless work of teaching small hands to form letters. And you practice, always practice, because the tremor hasn't gone away, it's merely hiding, waiting for a moment of weakness to reveal itself again. One evening, writing a letter to Mrs. Whitmore to thank her for her continued kindness, you notice something strange. Your handwriting has changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely changed. The slant is slightly different, the loops a little tighter, the whole script more compressed. You hadn't intended this change, hadn't consciously worked toward it, but somehow, over months of practice and adaptation, your hand has developed a new style. You study the letter, comparing it to old samples you've kept. The change is real, and it worries you. If your handwriting can change without your conscious direction, what else might change? What other aspects of your carefully constructed professional identity might be shifting beneath your notice? But then you think about Lady Ashworth, about the tremor she noticed, about the way your hand has learned to compensate, to hide its weakness behind these tighter loops and compressed letters. Perhaps the change isn't loss but adaptation. Perhaps your handwriting is evolving to meet the needs of your aging hand, finding new ways to perform the same old tricks. You finish the letter, seal it, and set it aside. Then you sit at your desk, looking out at the dark garden beyond the window, and you think about all the ways your handwriting has changed over the years, the shifts in style, the adaptations to different households, the accommodations to your body's limits. You're not the same person who first picked up a pen decades ago, and your handwriting reflects that. It carries the history of your life, recorded in the changing shapes of letters, the evolving slant, the subtle adjustments that have kept you employed, kept you alive, kept you yourself. The tremor may be a weakness, but your ability to adapt around it is a strength. And as long as you can adapt, as long as your hand can find new ways to form beautiful letters, you'll survive. You'll always survive. You're teaching Catherine to form the letter S when you notice something about her posture that stops you mid-sentence. She's hunched over her desk, shoulders rounded, neck craned forward, her whole body twisted into a shape that seems designed to cause maximum strain and minimum control. You've corrected her posture 100 times before, but somehow you've never really seen it. Never understood that the way she sits is not just a bad habit but a fundamental obstacle to everything you're trying to teach her. Stand up, you say, and she straightens automatically, used to obeying your instructions. No, I mean really stand up. Let me show you something. You position her chair properly, adjust the height of her desk as best you can, and then you guide her into the correct posture. Back straight but not rigid, shoulders relaxed, feet flat on the floor, the desk at a height that allows her arms to rest comfortably. She fidgets, uncomfortable in this unfamiliar position, but you hold her still and place a pen in her hand. Now write your name. She does, and the difference is immediate. Her letters are steadier, more controlled, more consistent. She stares at them in surprise, then looks up at you with something like wonder. How did you know that would work? You smile, because you remember learning this lesson yourself, years ago, from a governess who understood that handwriting isn't just about the hand, it's about the whole body, the way it sits and stands and moves, the physical foundation upon which all fine motor control is built. Your body has to be comfortable before your hand can do its work, you explain. If you're twisted or hunched, your hand can't move freely. The letters get twisted too. This is the hidden curriculum of penmanship, the part that never appears in copybooks or instruction manuals. Before you can teach a child to form letters, you have to teach them to sit, to hold themselves, to position their bodies in space. You have to correct not just their grip on the pen but the angle of their spine, the position of their shoulders, the distance between their eyes and the page. You have to become, in effect, a posture instructor, a physical therapist, a trainer of bodies as well as hands. The surprising historical detail that illuminates this work is that Victorian educators believed absolutely in the connection between physical posture and moral character. A child who sat up straight was a child with self-respect, with discipline, with the inner strength to resist temptation. A child who slouched was a child on the path to degeneracy, their slumped shoulders evidence of moral weakness. When you corrected Catherine's posture, you weren't just improving her handwriting, you were, in the Victorian mind, improving her soul. You think about this as you move through your days, correcting postures and adjusting grips and straightening spines. Margaret tends to lean too close to the page, her nose almost touching the paper, and you're constantly reminding her to sit back, to hold her head up, to give her eyes room to see. Catherine's problem is the slouch, the rounded shoulders that make her look smaller than she is, that seem to express a desire to disappear. Even little Amelia, only 7, has developed the habit of tilting her head to one side as she writes, a quirk that will become permanent if you don't correct it now. Each of these posture problems, you've learned, reflects something about the child who displays it. Margaret leans in because she's anxious, because she wants to see every detail, because she's afraid of making mistakes. Catherine slouches because she's uncomfortable in her own skin, because she hasn't yet learned to occupy space confidently, because she's waiting to be told who to be. Amelia tilts her head because she's watching her older sisters, imitating their habits without understanding why they have them. And your job, as their governess, is to correct not just the postures but the underlying attitudes, to teach Margaret to trust her eyes, to teach Catherine to hold herself proudly, to teach Amelia to find her own way rather than copying others. You do this through endless small corrections, through patient demonstrations, through the steady repetition of instructions that they'll resist and forget and eventually, slowly, internalize. The physicality of handwriting instruction extends beyond posture to the most basic elements of pen control. You teach the children how to hold the pen, not too tight, not too loose, with the fingers positioned just so and the wrist relaxed. You teach them how to move their arms across the page, drawing the strokes from the shoulder rather than the fingers, creating the flowing movement that produces elegant copperplate. You teach them how to breathe while they write, how to relax into the rhythm of the strokes, how to let the letters flow rather than forcing them onto the page. This is exhausting work, physically and mentally. By the end of a day of lessons, your own body aches from demonstrating postures, from leaning over small desks, from the constant effort of attention. Your voice is hoarse from endless corrections, your hand cramped from writing examples, your back stiff from sitting in chairs designed for children. You collapse into bed each night with the satisfaction of work done and the knowledge that tomorrow you'll do it all again. But there are moments when it all comes together, when something you've been teaching for weeks suddenly clicks. Margaret sits back from the page without being reminded, and her handwriting immediately improves. Catherine straightens her shoulders unconsciously, and her letters gain confidence. Amelia holds her head straight while copying her sisters, and you realize she's finally learned to be herself. These moments make everything worthwhile. They remind you why you do this work, why you've devoted your life to teaching children you'll eventually leave. They connect you to something larger than yourself, the long chain of instruction that stretches back through generations of governesses, each one passing on the physical wisdom of handwriting to the next. You think about your own governess, the one who taught you to sit up straight, to hold your pen correctly, to breathe while you write. You remember her patient corrections, her steady hands, the way she demonstrated each stroke until you could replicate it without thinking. She's been dead for years now, but you carry her teachings in your body, in the way you sit at your desk, in the way you hold your pen, in the letters that flow from your hand. She lives on in your handwriting, and you'll live on in the handwriting of the children you teach. This is the deeper meaning of your work, the truth that sustains you through the exhausting days and the lonely nights. You're not just teaching a skill, you're passing on a physical tradition, a way of being in the world, a connection to all the hands that have held pens before yours and all the hands that will hold them after. Your body, trained by years of practice, carries the memory of every governess who taught you, and it will pass that memory to these children, who will pass it to others, in an unbroken chain reaching forward and backward through time. Catherine writes her name again, this time with correct posture, and her letters are the best she's ever produced. She looks at them with pride, then looks at you, and you see in her eyes the beginning of understanding, not just of handwriting, but of herself, of what her body can do when she treats it with respect. Beautiful, you say quietly. Now do it again. And she does. The letter arrives on a Tuesday, tucked between a household bill and a note from Mrs. Whitmore's sister, and at first you barely notice it. Just another piece of correspondence among dozens. But something makes you pause, some instinct you've developed over years of handling letters, and you look more closely at the envelope. The handwriting is strange, not illegible, exactly, but unusual, with odd slants and unexpected formations that don't match any script you know. You open it carefully, and what you find inside makes your breath catch. It's a letter from a woman you've never met, written in a code you don't understand. Or rather, not a code exactly, but a system of marks within the handwriting itself. Certain letters are formed slightly differently than others, with extra pressure here, a longer loop there, a peculiar slant on specific words. At first you think it's just poor penmanship, the work of someone who never mastered copperplate. But the more you study it, the more you suspect otherwise. The letter appears to be a simple note of introduction, explaining that the writer is a former governess who heard of you through mutual acquaintances and wishes to correspond. But those marks, those tiny variations in otherwise normal handwriting, they seem intentional, purposeful, as if they are trying to communicate something beyond the surface meaning of the words. You've heard rumors, over the years, about governesses who developed secret systems of communication, ways of hiding messages in plain sight, of conveying information that couldn't be spoken aloud. The rumors always seemed like fantasies, the kind of stories lonely women tell each other to pass the time. But now, holding this letter, you wonder. You study it for hours, comparing the unusual formations, trying to discern a pattern. Some letters are written with heavier pressure than others, not enough to be obvious, but enough to notice if you're looking for it. Certain words have loops that extend further than normal, or slant slightly differently from the surrounding text. A few letters are formed in ways that deviate subtly from standard copperplate, as if the writer learned a different script and occasionally slips into it. By evening, you've convinced yourself that there's something here, some message hidden in the handwriting, some communication beyond the words on the page. But you can't decipher it, can't find the key, can't unlock whatever secret the writer was trying to share. You write back that night, keeping your response ordinary, friendly, unremarkable. but you find yourself experimenting with your own handwriting as you write, making tiny variations that might, to someone looking for them, carry meaning. A slightly larger loop here. A bit of extra pressure there. Nothing obvious, nothing that would attract attention, but variations that could, in theory, be part of a system. The surprising historical detail that emerges over the following weeks is that you're not imagining things. Your correspondent writes back, and her letter contains more of those subtle variations, and gradually you begin to notice patterns. Certain variations that appear consistently, certain formations that seem to correspond to specific words or ideas. It's like learning a new language, one written not in words but in the minute details of penmanship. You learn, eventually, that there's a whole network of governesses who communicate this way, women scattered across the country, connected by letters written in code hidden within apparently ordinary handwriting. They share information about households, about employers, about positions available and positions to avoid. They warn each other of dangers, men who make inappropriate advances, mistresses who mistreat their governesses, households where the children are cruel or the conditions unbearable. They offer support, friendship, the comfort of knowing they are not alone. The code is simple once you understand it. Specific variations correspond to specific letters of the alphabet, allowing messages to be hidden within ordinary text. A loop that extends too far might indicate the letter A. Extra pressure on a downstroke might mean B. A slight change in slant could signal C. By combining these variations, a writer can embed whole sentences in what appears to be normal correspondence, invisible to anyone who isn't looking for them. You practice the code obsessively, teaching your hand to make these tiny variations without conscious thought, embedding messages in every letter you write. Your correspondents write back, their hidden messages growing more complex as your skill improves. You learn about households in Scotland, in Wales, in distant counties you'll never visit. You learn about governesses who've been dismissed unfairly, who've found better positions, who've married and left the profession entirely. You learn that you're part of something larger than yourself, a community of women, connected by pen and paper and the shared experience of lives spent in other people's houses. Historians still argue whether these coded communications actually existed, or whether they are merely legends passed down among governesses. You don't have to argue. You know they are real because you're living them, because your hand now moves in ways that carry hidden meanings, because the letters you receive contain messages that only you can read. The code serves practical purposes, certainly, warning of dangerous households, sharing information about positions, but it serves emotional purposes too. In a profession defined by isolation, by the constant awareness that you don't quite belong anywhere, these coded letters connect you to others who understand your life. They remind you that you're not alone, that somewhere out there, other women are sitting at other desks, writing letters with hidden messages, reaching across the miles to touch each other's lives. One letter brings news that makes you weep. A governess you've corresponded with for years has finally left the profession, marrying a widower she met through her position. Her farewell message, hidden in the loops of an apparently ordinary letter, thanks you for your friendship, for the years of coded support, for helping her survive until she could find happiness. You'll never meet her, never see her face, but you feel her absence like a physical loss. Another letter brings warning. A household in the next county has a terrible reputation, the master known for inappropriate behavior toward governesses, the mistress turning a blind eye. You pass the warning along, embedding it in your next letters, trusting that the network will spread the word and save some woman from suffering. You think, sometimes, about the generations of governesses who came before you, who must have developed similar systems of communication, ways of sharing information, of supporting each other, of surviving in a profession that offered so little security and so much isolation. You think about the letters that must have passed between them, hidden messages in beautiful copperplate, carrying warnings and comfort and the quiet solidarity of women who understood each other's lives. And you think about the future, about the children you're teaching now, who will grow up and perhaps become governesses themselves, who will need this network, this coded community, this way of reaching across the miles to find each other. Will you pass the code to them? Will you teach them, as you were taught, to hide messages in their handwriting, to find community in the margins of ordinary correspondence? You decide, eventually, that you will. Not now, they are too young, too likely to reveal secrets without understanding them. But when they are older, when they are facing the same profession you've faced, you'll find a way to share what you've learned. You'll give them the gift of connection, of community, of knowing they are not alone. For now, you write your coded letters, receive your coded replies, and feel the invisible network of women stretching across the country, holding each other up through the simple act of writing. Your hand moves across the page, forming letters that carry messages within messages, and you smile at the thought of all those hidden words, all those secret communications, all those women who found a way to speak when society expects them to be silent. The code is simple. The code is profound. The code is survival. The letter you're about to write will change everything, and you know it even before you dip your pen in the ink. Your hand hovers over the page, trembling slightly, not from age or exhaustion this time, but from the weight of what you're about to do. You're going to forge a character reference. You're going to write a letter pretending to be someone you're not, recommending a woman you've never met, and you're going to do it because she's desperate and you're desperate, and sometimes desperation is the only thing that connects one human being to another. Her name is Agnes, and you met her 3 days ago at the village inn, where she'd come seeking a position and found nothing but closed doors and polite refusals. She's younger than you, maybe 30, with the faded prettiness of a woman who's been worn down by years of struggle. Over tea in the inn's small parlor, she told you her story. Dismissed from her last position after the master of the house made advances she refused, given a reference that hinted at unsuitability without stating outright what had happened, now unable to find anyone who will hire her because that vague reference follows her everywhere. You know this story. You've heard variations of it a dozen times, from a dozen different women, and you know that Agnes is telling the truth because the truth has a particular weight, a particular texture, that fiction can't quite replicate. You also know that without a better reference, she'll never find another position, that she'll drift from inn to inn, spending her meager savings, until finally she ends up in the workhouse or worse. So when she asked, hesitantly, whether you might know anyone who could provide a reference, anyone at all, you heard yourself offering before you'd fully considered what you were offering. You'd write it yourself, you said. You'd write a reference in the name of a former employer who'd moved abroad, who couldn't be contacted, whose handwriting you could imitate well enough to pass casual inspection. Agnes stared at you for a long moment, then burst into tears. Now you sit at your desk, a blank page before you, and you wonder if you're making the biggest mistake of your life. Forgery is a crime. If you're caught, you'll not only lose your position, you could face prison, transportation, complete social ruin. Everything you've worked for, everything you've built, could be destroyed by this one act of desperate kindness. But you think about Agnes, about the tears streaming down her face, about the way she gripped your hands and thanked you as if you'd saved her life. And you think about all the other Agneses you've known, all the women destroyed by vague references and unspoken accusations, all the lives ruined because one man's word outweighed a woman's truth. You begin to write. The handwriting you're imitating belongs to a woman you met briefly years ago, a lady of impeccable reputation who moved to Italy with her husband and hasn't been heard from since. You studied her handwriting then, as you study everyone's, noticing the particular way she formed her capital letters, the slight backward slant that distinguished her script, the tiny flourish she added to her signature. You've practiced it over the years, partly as a technical exercise and partly because you never know when such skills might prove useful. Now they're proving very useful indeed. Your hand moves carefully, forming each letter with deliberate attention to the details that matter. The capital A must have that particular curve, that slight hesitation before the downstroke. The lowercase letters must lean backward just slightly, not enough to be obvious but enough to match the original. The signature, the most dangerous part, must be perfect, must capture not just the shapes of the letters but the rhythm, the flow, the indefinable something that makes a signature unique. You write slowly, pausing frequently to check your work, to compare it to the memory of the original, to ensure that every detail is correct. The letter recommends Agnes warmly, praising her character, her skills, her suitability for any position. It mentions that the writer has known Agnes for years, has watched her work with children, has complete confidence in her abilities. It's exactly the kind of reference that could save a woman's life. When you finish, you sit back and examine the page. The handwriting is perfect, or as perfect as you can make it, given the limitations of memory and practice. Anyone who knew the original writer well might spot the difference, but the chances of that are small. The writer is in Italy. The household where Agnes will use this reference is in another county. The risk, while real, is manageable. You seal the letter with a wafer, address it to Agnes in a hand that's deliberately different from the one you used in the reference, and tuck it into your pocket to deliver tomorrow. Then you sit in the darkness, your heart pounding, and you wonder what you've just done. The surprising historical detail that haunts you in this moment is that forgery was surprisingly common among Victorian governesses. Not forgery for personal gain, usually, but forgery as survival, as mutual aid, as the only way women could help each other in a system designed to keep them powerless. You've heard rumors of governesses who specialized in creating references, who could imitate any handwriting after studying it briefly, who supplied desperate women with the documents they needed to survive. You never thought you'd become one of them, but here you are. You deliver the letter to Agnes the next morning, and she takes it with trembling hands, reading it carefully, then looking up at you with an expression of such profound gratitude that you almost weep yourself. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispers. "Use it well," you say. "Find a good position, a kind household. Live the life you deserve." She nods, tucks the letter into her bag, and leaves the inn. You watch her go, wondering if you'll ever see her again, wondering if you've saved her or merely delayed her destruction. Then you return to your duties, to the children and the lessons and the endless performance of being a governess. Weeks pass. You hear nothing from Agnes, and you try not to think about her, try not to imagine the letter being examined, the forgery being discovered, the consequences spreading outward like ripples in a pond. You focus on your work, on Margaret and Catherine, on the daily rhythm that has defined your life for so long. And then, one afternoon, a letter arrives. It's from Agnes, posted from a county far to the north. She's found a position, she writes, a good position, with a kind family who welcomed her warmly. The reference you wrote was never questioned, never examined too closely. She's safe, she's employed, she's grateful beyond words. You read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down your face, and you realize that you've done something meaningful, something that matters beyond the endless rounds of practice and teaching and performance. You've used your handwriting not just to survive, but to save. You've taken the skill that has defined your life and turned it towards something larger than yourself. You write back to Agnes, in your normal handwriting this time, wishing her well and asking her to pass on the favor if she ever meets another woman in need. Then you tuck her letter into your drawer, next to Charles's drawing and Eleanor's note and all the other small treasures that remind you why this work matters. That night, you practice your handwriting as always, but something has changed. The letters flowing from your pen seem different somehow, more purposeful, more meaningful. You're not just maintaining a skill anymore, not just performing for employers and inspectors. You're carrying forward a tradition of women helping women, of using whatever tools you have to support each other in a world that offers little support. Your hand moves steadily across the page, forming perfect copperplate, and you think about all the letters you'll write in the years ahead. References for desperate women, warnings for those in danger, coded messages for the network that sustains you. You think about Agnes, safe in her northern household, living the life your handwriting helped her find. And you smile, because for once, your perfect script has done more than just keep you employed. It's kept someone else alive. The fire has burned low in the grate, and you sit in your small room with a letter in your hands that you've read a dozen times already, though you received it weeks ago. It's from Margaret, your former pupil, now grown and married and living in London, and in it she tells you that she's been thinking about the handwriting lessons you gave her all those years ago. She writes that she still practices, still remembers your corrections, still hears your voice in her head when she forms certain letters. She thanks you for the gift of beautiful handwriting, a gift she says she'll carry with her always. You hold the letter carefully, studying the handwriting with the same attention you've given to every piece of writing that's passed through your hands. Margaret's script has matured over the years, developed its own character, its own distinctive flourishes. But you can still see the foundation you gave her, the basic shapes, the consistent slant, the careful attention to form. Your teaching lives on in her handwriting, in every letter she writes, in every document she signs. You think about all the children you've taught over the decades, all the small hands you've guided, all the young minds you've shaped. Charles, who fought you so fiercely, now a respected solicitor whose legal documents are admired for their clarity and precision. Eleanor, whose fierce determination produced handwriting almost as beautiful as your own, now a mother teaching her own children to form their letters. Little Amelia, grown and married and living in America, whose letters arrive irregularly but always in a hand that shows the care you instilled. And you think about Agnes, somewhere in the north, still employed, still safe, still living the life your forgery helped her find. You've never told anyone about that letter, never spoken of it aloud, but you think about it often, about the risk you took, the difference it made, the proof that handwriting can be more than just beautiful. The fire crackles softly, and you set Margaret's letter aside to look around your room. It's smaller now than some you've had, but it's yours, paid for by years of service and the small savings you've accumulated. The writing desk is still there, still covered with paper and pens and ink, still waiting for your daily practice. But you practice less now, your hand too stiff some days to form the letters you once produced with such ease. The tremor that appeared years ago has grown worse, and your copperplate is no longer what it was. But you still write. Every day, you write something, a letter to a former pupil, a note to the woman who brings your meals, an entry in the journal you've kept for decades. Your handwriting may have changed, may have lost some of its perfection, but it's still yours, still carries your character, still connects you to the world. The surprising historical truth you've come to understand, sitting here in the twilight of your career, is that handwriting was never really about perfection. All those hours of practice, all that desperate striving for flawless copperplate, it mattered, yes, but not in the way you thought. What mattered wasn't the perfect letters themselves, but the discipline they required, the character they built, the person you became through the endless effort of forming them. Your handwriting now, with its tremor and its imperfections, tells a truer story than your perfect copperplate ever could. It tells of years of service, of hands that have guided countless children, of a life lived in dedication to something beyond yourself. It tells of late nights and early mornings, of desperate practice and hidden codes, of forgery for survival and letters that saved lives. It tells of you, all of you, not just the surface you presented to employers and inspectors. Historians still argue about what Victorian handwriting really meant, whether it was oppression or expression, conformity or creativity, a tool of control or a medium of liberation. From where you sit, watching the fire fade and the shadows lengthen, the answer seems clear. It was all of those things, and more. It was the medium through which you lived your life, the skill that sustained you, the art that defined you. You pick up your pen one more time, feeling the familiar weight of it in your hand, the way it fits against your fingers after all these years. You dip it in the ink, watching the nib draw up the dark fluid, and you write your name on a fresh sheet of paper. The letters tremble slightly, waver in ways they never would have years ago, but they are still recognizable, still yours, still a record of who you are. Outside your window, the hills of Derbyshire are fading into twilight, the same hills you've watched for decades from this room. The world has changed around you. Typewriters clicking in offices, telephones ringing in wealthy homes, even rumors of horseless carriages that will someday fill the roads. But here, in this small room, you still write by hand, still form letters the way you were taught, still carry forward the tradition that has defined your life. You think about the children you've taught, scattered now across the country and beyond, each one carrying a piece of you in their handwriting. You think about the women you've helped, the letters you've written, the hidden messages that connected you to a network of souls across the miles. You think about all the hours of practice, all the aching hands, all the desperate striving for perfection, and you realize that it was worth it, every moment of it. Because handwriting, you've learned, is not really about the marks on the page. It's about the hands that make them, the lives that shape them, the connections they create between human beings separated by time and distance and circumstance. It's about reaching across the years to touch someone you'll never meet, leaving a piece of yourself on paper for strangers to find, participating in the great human conversation that stretches from the past into the future. You set down your pen and blow out your candle, letting the darkness settle around you like a familiar blanket. The fire has faded to embers now, glowing softly in the grate, and you sit watching them as your eyes grow heavy. You think about tomorrow, about the letter you'll write to Margaret, about the journal entry you'll make, about the small ways you'll continue to put pen to paper and leave your mark on the world. And as sleep begins to claim you, you feel at peace, not because your handwriting was perfect, but because it was yours, because it carried you through a life of service and struggle and small triumphs, because it connected you to everyone you've ever taught and everyone who taught you, because it was, in the end, enough. The fire fades, the room grows cold, and you drift into dreams filled with letters, endless letters, flowing across pages like water, each one perfect in its own imperfect way, each one a small piece of the story you've lived. And somewhere in those dreams, you're young again, sitting at a desk in a cold nursery, practicing your ovals and loops while the world sleeps around you, preparing for a life you couldn't yet imagine. Your hand moves in your sleep, tracing letters on the sheets, and you smile at whatever dream you're writing. Tomorrow, you'll write again. So now, as the fire settles into its final embers and the room grows quiet around you, let the weight of all those letters slowly drift away. Let the perfect copperplate fade from your mind's eye, the hours of practice become a distant memory, the trembling hand finally still. You've written enough for one lifetime, more than enough, really, and now it's time to rest. The world outside continues its rush toward the future, toward typewriters and telephones and screens you can't imagine. But here, in this small room at the edge of the Derbyshire hills, there's only the soft glow of fading coals and the gentle rhythm of your breathing. The letters you've written over the years are scattered now, tucked into drawers and albums, and the memories of those who received them, each one a small piece of you carried forward into a future you'll never see. But that's all right. That's more than all right. Because handwriting was never meant to last forever. It was meant to connect, to communicate, to reach across the space between one human heart and another. And yours has done that, countless times, in ways you'll never fully know. So close your eyes now, and let the darkness take you. Let the pen slip from your fingers, the paper fade from your thoughts, the words dissolve into the quiet. You've earned this rest, this peace, this moment of simply being, without performance, without practice, without perfection. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the world, someone is reading a letter you wrote, seeing your handwriting, feeling the connection you reached across years to make. Sleep well, knowing that your hand has touched more lives than you'll ever count. Sleep well, knowing that you wrote your story, one perfect letter at a time. And when you wake, if you choose to write again, your hand will remember. It always remembers.